The wind, a biting, relentless beast, whipped around Eleanor Jenkins, its icy breath seeping through the layers of her worn coat. At 72, each step on the slick, rain-lashed trail was a calculated risk. She was coming back from the little cemetery plot high on Applegate Mountain, where her mother lay buried, a place as rugged and solitary as the life she herself now led. The Oregon rain, cold and persistent, had turned the familiar path into a treacherous slide. Eleanor muttered a curse at the sky, a habit picked up from a lifetime spent talking more to the mountains than to people. She never imagined that a simple misstep on this dreary afternoon would be the first tremor of an earthquake that would shake her world to its core, setting her on a path of grim discovery and a fight for justice she hadn't bargained for. It happened fast. One moment she was navigating a particularly slick patch of mud, her old boots struggling for purchase. The next, her feet went out from under her. She yelped, a small, undignified sound swallowed by the wind, and instinctively threw out a hand. Her palm slammed against a large, moss-covered rock embedded in the hillside. The impact, coupled with the loosened, rain-soaked earth, was enough. The rock, a sentinel that had likely stood for decades, groaned and then, with a sickening lurch, tumbled away down the slope. Eleanor, catching her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs, pushed herself up on shaky elbows. That's when she saw it. Where the rock had been, nestled in the raw, damp earth, something gleamed, even in the dim, storm-filtered light. Its allure was undeniable. Gold, not just a few flakes, or a small nugget like the old-timers used to find. This was a mass of it, a vein of pure, unadulterated gold, as thick as a logger's arm, exposed to the world for the first time in who knew how long. It pulsed with a soft, internal light, a stark, rich yellow against the dark soil, like a dragon's eye winking from its hoard. This wasn't just gold, it felt ancient, a secret whispered from the frantic days of the Western gold rush. A treasure buried and forgotten, now unearthed by a storm and a stumble. A tremor, colder than the rain, ran through Eleanor. She didn't touch it, couldn't. Instead, her trembling fingers fumbled for the old smartphone in her pocket, a concession to her worried nephew. She snapped a few blurry pictures, the golden gleam stark even on the small screen. Then, with a resolve that belied her shaking legs, she turned and began the treacherous descent. This was too big for one old woman. This was for the law. She'd report it to Sheriff Roy McLean, down in town. Sheriff Roy McLean had a reputation in Applegate County, or at least he used to. Most folks still saw him as the straight-shooting, fair-minded lawman he'd been when he first pinned on the badge 20 years ago. But time, and perhaps the quiet, insidious temptations of power in a small, isolated town, had done their work. The core of him, once solid as Oregon oak, had begun to rot when Eleanor Jenkins, soaked and shivering, breathlessly told her tale of a mountain of gold. A different kind of gleam lit McLean's eyes, not of justice, but of avarice. He couldn't believe his luck, and he sure as hell wasn't about to share it. This was his. He played the part, of course, listened with feigned concern, nodding gravely as Eleanor described the location. He gathered 2 of his deputies, Jared and young Pete, and even called in a local appraiser he knew would keep his mouth shut. And they headed up the mountain with Eleanor. The appraiser, a weaselly man named Silas, confirmed its purity and staggering potential value with wide, greedy eyes. McLean feigned official procedure, taking notes, asking questions, but when Eleanor, regaining some of her composure, mentioned that the land, including the spot where the gold was found, had been in her family for generations, that her mother had lived there, and she had the deed, the inheritance papers to prove it, McLean's mask slipped. Now, Eleanor, he said, his voice dripping with a sudden, chilling condescension, you really think the county, the state, is gonna care about some dusty old piece of paper an old woman waves around? The air crackled. Eleanor, though old, was no fool, and she wasn't easily intimidated. She'd faced down blizzards, bears, and loneliness. A corrupt sheriff didn't scare her nearly as much. That dusty old paper is a legal document, Sheriff, and this is my land. That gold is mine. Is that so? McLean's voice was soft, dangerous, We'll see what the authorities have to say about that. If you think you can just take it, you're wrong, Eleanor said, her voice rising. I'll get a lawyer. I'll call the papers, the TV stations. Everyone will know what you're trying to do. She was furious now, her initial shock replaced by a protective rage. This is my property. Get off my land. McLean, all of you. McLean's face purpled. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by an old woman. He stepped towards her, his bulk menacing. You don't tell me what to do, you old hag. Words turned into a shove, whether he meant to, or whether it was the slit ground in his own rage. McLean pushed Eleanor hard. She stumbled backwards, her arms flailing, and then, with a horrified cry, she pitched sideways, disappearing over the steep, muddy edge of the trail. Tumbling down the ravine, there was a sickening thud. Then silence, broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain. Panic, cold and stark, seized McLean. He scrambled to the edge. Peering down, Eleanor lay unnervingly still at the bottom of the gully, a crumpled heap in the mud. He thought she was dead. His mind raced, not with remorse, but with self-preservation. The gold, the witnesses, his career, his deputies, Jared and Pete, and the appraiser, Silas, stared at him, their faces pale. None of them were paragons of virtue. Jared was drowning in gambling debts. Pete was young, dumb, and easily led, and Silas had his own shady dealings. They were all compromised, all greedy. She slipped, McLean stammered, but no one was buying it. His eyes met Jared's, then Pete's, and unspoken, ugly understanding passed between them. The appraiser, Silas, looked like he was about to be sick, but a sharp glance from McLean silenced any protest. Nobody will find her here, McLean said, his voice regaining a sliver of its customary authority. Though it was strained, we gotta move her, deep into the national forest. Somewhere she'll never be found. The decision was made in that desperate, rain-soaked moment. They hauled Eleanor's limp body out of the gully. It was a grim, hurried task. They loaded her into the back of McLean's county vehicle. Like a sack of feed, they drove for miles, deep into the remote wilderness of the surrounding national forest. Far from any trails, the vehicle's tires churning through mud and over rough terrain. Finally, they found a narrow, overgrown ravine, almost a fissure in the earth. They dumped her body there, covering it hastily with loose rocks, branches, and forest debris. A crude, unmarked grave. Back in the relative dryness of the truck, soaked and muddy, McLean looked at his accomplices. She's gone. No one saw anything. No one will connect it to us. Or the gold. We keep our mouths shut. We get that gold out, sell it quiet, and we all get a piece of the pie. A very big piece. His voice was firm now, the voice of a man sealing a dark pact. They moved fast. Within days, McLean had discreetly contacted a shadowy buyer, someone used to dealing in commodities with no questions asked, under the cover of night, using equipment borrowed from the county and some rented under false pretenses. They began the clandestine operation to extract the gold. The earth yielded its treasure with shocking generosity. In the first week alone, they'd mined and sold off enough to net nearly $100 million. The money was laundered through a series of shell corporations McLean had the foresight to set up years ago for just such a rainy day. They thought they were safe. They thought Eleanor Jenkins was just a ghost, a problem solved, but they didn't know Eleanor, and they didn't know she was still alive. Pain, sharp and brutal, was the first thing to pierce the black fog that had enveloped Eleanor. It was a symphony of agony, a throbbing head, ribs that screamed with every shallow breath, and a searing fire in her leg. For a moment, she didn't know where she was, only that she was cold, damp, and half-buried. Then memory, cruel and vivid, returned. McLean's contorted face, the shove, the sickening fall. They'd left her for dead. She blinked, her vision slowly clearing. She was at the bottom of a narrow, debris-strewn ravine. Above, a sliver of angry gray sky. Days must have passed. Thirst was a torment, hunger a gnawing emptiness. The initial shock wore off, replaced by a primal instinct to survive. But movement was a fresh hell. Her left leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, the bone clearly broken. Worse, the metallic, coppery scent of blood, mingled with the damp earth, had attracted visitors. Ants, bold and relentless, were crawling over her, their bites tiny stabs of fire on her exposed skin. Other insects buzzed, drawn to her wounds. A wave of despair threatened to drown her. But then, a flicker of the stubborn grit that had defined her life ignited. They will not win, the thought was a lifeline. Painfully, inch by agonizing inch, she began to move, using her good leg and her raw, scraped elbows. Eleanor dragged herself out from under the rocks and branches McLean and his cronies had so carelessly thrown over her. Every movement sent jolts of agony through her body, but the image of McLean's treacherous smirk fueled her. It took what felt like an eternity, but she finally hauled herself out of the shallow grave they dug for her. The surrounding forest was dense, unfamiliar. She was miles from anywhere, or so it felt. Dehydration and blood loss made her dizzy, her thoughts cloudy, but some instinct, honed by years of living in the wilderness, guided her. She knew, vaguely, that there were old hunting trails and abandoned cabins scattered throughout these woods. She just had to find one. Driven by a will that amazed even herself, she crawled, then limped, then crawled again, fashioning a crude crutch from a fallen branch. She ate wild berries she vaguely recognized as edible, drank from muddy puddles, her body screaming in protest. The nights were the worst, filled with the sounds of the forest and the gnawing cold, her pain a constant companion. After what she guessed were 2, maybe 3 days of this tortuous journey, she stumbled upon it, a dilapidated hunter's lean-to, barely more than a few rotting logs and a tattered piece of canvas for a roof. But to Eleanor, it was a palace. Inside, miraculously, she found a forgotten stash, a couple of tins of ancient beans, a half-empty bottle of water, and, blessedly, a rusty first aid kit with some gauze and antiseptic. There, hidden from the world, Eleanor began the slow, painful process of mending. She cleaned her wounds as best she could, the antiseptic stinging fiercely. She forced down the cold beans, the taste metallic but life-sustaining. She splinted her broken leg with sticks and strips of her own torn clothing. Days bled into a week, then another. The physical pain slowly began to subside, replaced by a cold, hard fury. They had tried to kill her. They had stolen her gold, her land, her peace. They thought they had silenced her. They were wrong. As her strength gradually returned, a plan began to form in her mind. Going to the local authorities was out of the question. McLean was the authorities. No, this required a different approach. A quieter, more cunning strategy. Eleanor Jenkins, the reclusive old woman of Applegate Mountain, was dead to the world. It was time for that ghost to come back and haunt those who had wronged her. One moonless night, weeks after her presumed demise, Eleanor Jenkins slipped back into her own life as silently as a forest shadow. She knew these mountains, these woods, better than anyone. She'd grown up exploring every creek bed, every hidden trail, every shortcut that wasn't marked on any map. She avoided the main roads, sticking to the dense undergrowth, moving with a stealth that would have surprised men half her age. Her small cabin, nestled on the outskirts of her property, looked deserted, just as she'd expected. They wouldn't be watching it. Not anymore. She let herself in through a back window she knew had a loose latch. The air inside was stale, cold. She didn't turn on any lights, didn't make a sound. For weeks, she lived like a phantom in her own home, existing on the canned goods and dried foods she'd always kept stocked. She moved only at night, a ghost tending to her wounds and her simmering rage. Her first priority was to contact the only person in the world she knew she could trust implicitly, her nephew. James. He was a tech whiz, a software engineer working for some big company up in Seattle. Years ago, he'd had a rebellious streak, a phase where he dabbled in the shadier side of the internet, a white-hat hacker. He'd called himself, always insisting he used his powers for good. Eleanor had practically raised him after his parents died, and their bond was strong. Getting a secure message to him was tricky. She couldn't use her own phone or computer. McLean might have them monitored. Eventually, using an ancient, untraceable burner phone she'd bought years ago for emergencies and forgotten in a drawer, she managed to send a cryptic, coded text. James arrived a few days later, under the guise of checking on his missing aunt's estate. He was shocked at her appearance, thinner, scarred, but with a fire in her eyes he hadn't seen in years. He didn't ask too many questions. The grim set of her jaw and the story she briefly recounted told him enough. His aunt, the woman who had shown him nothing but kindness, had been betrayed and left for dead. That was all he needed to know. The old hacker instincts, dormant for years, resurfaced with a vengeance. Together, in the dim light of Eleanor's shuttered cabin, they began to lay their trap. First, James said, his fingers already flying across the keyboard of his sleek laptop, "We need to stop them from completely stripping that mountain and covering their tracks." His plan was elegant in its simplicity. They would anonymously petition the state's Historical Preservation Society and the Bureau of Land Management. Using carefully fabricated geological and archaeological evidence, Eleanor's photos of the gold, carefully stripped of metadata, were a starting point to suggest the area around Eleanor's find was a site of significant historical importance. Possibly an ancient Native American burial ground or a lost pioneer settlement. If we can get an injunction, even a temporary one, it'll buy us time and stop them from destroying the scene of their primary crime, the illegal mining. Next, an anonymous tip, carefully worded and routed through multiple encrypted servers, would be sent to the State Investigation Bureau, hinting at corruption within the Applegate Sheriff's Department and unspecified illegal activities. It wouldn't be enough to act on immediately, but it would plant a seed of suspicion. The real ace up their sleeve, however, was something Eleanor hadn't even known existed. 2 years prior, James, worried about his aging aunt living alone, had installed a series of discreet, solar-powered security cameras around her property, camouflaged as birdhouses and garden ornaments. They uploaded their footage to a secure cloud server. "I set them up mostly to keep an eye on the garden and make sure you were okay from afar, Auntie," he explained. Now, those cameras would become key witnesses. James began meticulously combing through weeks of archived footage, specifically from the day Eleanor reported the gold and the days following her disappearance. He was looking for anything, McLean's vehicle, his deputies, any unusual activity that could corroborate Eleanor's story of her initial report and their subsequent visit to her land before she vanished. The photos Eleanor had taken of the gold on her phone, with their embedded GPS data, would pinpoint the exact location of her discovery and her confrontation with McLean. Eleanor watched him work, a grim satisfaction settling in. The wheels of her revenge were slowly, silently, beginning to turn. Weeks turned into a tense month. Eleanor and James worked in the shadows, meticulously building their case. The anonymous petition to the State Historical Society had borne fruit faster than they'd hoped. A temporary injunction was placed on any development or resource extraction in the specified area of Applegate Mountain. Citing the need for further archaeological assessment, McLean and his crew were furious. Their illegal gold mines suddenly frozen. But they couldn't overtly challenge the state's ruling without drawing unwanted attention. The anonymous tip to the State Investigation Bureau, SIB, had also been logged. A small flag raised in a system overburdened with such claims, but a flag nonetheless. The real breakthrough came from James's diligent work with the security camera footage and his more proactive digital investigations. He'd found it, grainy footage from one of the birdhouse cameras showing McLean's official vehicle, along with Jared and Pete's patrol car, leaving Eleanor's property late on the day she'd reported the gold. It wasn't damning in itself, but it corroborated her timeline. Then James, using skills he hadn't employed in years, carefully and untraceably probed the town's municipal network. He was looking for anything related to McLean's off-book activities. What he found was gold of a different kind, buried deep in the poorly secured internal servers of the sheriff's department. He located fragmented audio from a corrupted body cam file, Pete's. As it turned out, from the day they'd disposed of Eleanor. The video was mostly unusable, but the audio, cleaned up and amplified, was chilling. McLean's voice, unmistakable. "Just make sure it's deep. No one ever finds her. Call it Don Depp Kizak. Clean up the body. This is our only way out." James also uncovered a string of suspicious financial transactions, Large sums of money moving through obscure accounts linked to McLean and a newly formed consulting company with Jared's wife listed as the sole director. This digital breadcrumb trail painted a clear picture of money laundering. Armed with this, James compiled a comprehensive, anonymous digital package. Eleanor's photos of the gold, the GPS data, the security camera logs, the damning audio snippet, the financial red flags, and a detailed map pinpointing the illegal mining operation, gleaned from satellite imagery cross-referenced with Eleanor's initial description. He sent it directly to a contact he had from his old White Hat days. Someone now working high up in a federal agency that specialized in public corruption. This time, the response was swift. Federal investigators, working with the SIB, descended upon the small town of Applegate. One crisp morning, as Sheriff Roy McLean sat in his office, smugly reviewing reports about the stalled gold extraction, the door burst open. Federal agents, stone-faced and implacable, swarmed his office. The raid was thorough. They seized his computer, his phone, and boxes of files. The preliminary findings were devastating for McLean. James's meticulously recovered audio fragment was just the tip of the iceberg. A deeper forensic analysis of confiscated devices uncovered more incriminating communications. The suspicious banking records led them to accounts overflowing with untraceable cash, bribes paid to silence the appraiser and secured illicit permits. On McLean's personal phone, they found satellite images of the ravine where Eleanor had been left, along with detailed, hand-drawn maps of the secret mining area, complete with extraction plans and estimated yields. Cross-referencing financial data and phone records, they quickly identified and apprehended the out-of-state gold buyers just as they were attempting to move a significant shipment across state lines, preparing it for international transit. A substantial amount of the stolen gold was recovered. As the evidence mounted, witness by witness, McLean's carefully constructed world crumbled. The appraiser, Silas, facing federal charges, sang like a canary. Even young Pete, terrified and seeing his life flash before his eyes, broke down and confessed his role, implicating Jared and McLean in everything from the assault on Eleanor to the illegal mining and the attempted cover-up. Sheriff Roy McLean, the man who thought he could steal a mountain of gold and get away with murder, slumped over his desk, a broken man, as the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. The arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by a mask of disbelief and dawning terror. The trials were swift. The evidence, both physical and digital, was overwhelming. Roy McLean, facing a mountain of charges including attempted murder, conspiracy, grand larceny, and abuse of power, was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, a stark end to his reign of corruption. Jared, the deputy entangled in gambling debts, and Pete, the young officer who'd followed orders, both received significantly lighter sentences in exchange for their full confessions and cooperation with the prosecution. They testified against McLean, their voices heavy with the weight of their actions. The land, the source of so much greed and violence, was officially and unequivocally recognized as the legal inheritance of Eleanor Jenkins. The cloud of uncertainty that had hung over her family's legacy for years was finally lifted. News of the old woman who had been left for dead in a ravine, only to rise again and bring down a corrupt sheriff, spread like wildfire. Eleanor, however, shunned the spotlight. She had her land back, her peace restored, and justice had been served. That was enough. The gold, recovered by the federal authorities, was substantial. After legal proceedings, a significant portion was returned to Eleanor as the rightful owner. But Eleanor, a woman who had always lived simply, found she had little desire for such immense wealth. She kept only a very small fraction for herself and James, enough to live comfortably and ensure her nephew's future. The vast majority she donated. A large portion went to a national environmental trust, with the explicit agreement that they would preserve the wild beauty of her mountain, ensuring no mine would ever scar it again. Another significant sum went to a charitable foundation supporting elderly individuals in need. A quiet nod to the vulnerability she herself had experienced. Eleanor Jenkins returned to her cabin on Applegate Mountain. She meticulously repaired the small damages incurred during her weeks of clandestine living. her hands finding comfort in the familiar tasks. She tended her garden with a renewed sense of peace, coaxing life from the rich Oregon soil. When she walked the familiar trails, it was no longer with a shadow of fear looking over her shoulder, but with the quiet, unshakable strength of a survivor who had faced the darkness and emerged. In the small communities that dotted the valleys below, she became something of a local legend, a reluctant icon. People spoke of her not just for the miracle of her survival against the odds, but for her unyielding courage, a powerful testament to how even one seemingly ordinary person, armed with truth and an unbreakable spirit, could stand firm against the insidious rod of power and ultimately prevail. The ancient mountain continued to hold its timeless secrets, but Eleanor Jenkins, its steadfast guardian, finally felt free of hers.